Welcome to part 4 of our series on the book Falling Flat by Danny Faulkner. If you recall, last time we left off with him speaking about the hulls of boats disappearing first and how it doesn't prove anything about Earth shape. It proves more about optics and their limits and the fluctuations between ourselves and the object we're viewing. And just before he ends that section, this is where we're picking up here. He talks about, he says, all magnification does is make an image appear larger. It cannot bring into view things that are not in the view to begin with. And this is a flat earth argument because we say the same thing. How can you tell me that you can watch a boat go over the horizon hull first, and then I can bring it back with a telephoto lens or telescope, and somehow this still proves that the Earth is a ball when you told me that the Earth itself, the sea or whatever, was obstructing our view? It can't have been obstructing our view if we can bring it back. So now his excuse after this is, it's especially, he says, the photograph that he took in Virginia Beach demonstrated that when no temperature inversion is present, ships do indeed disappear hull first. As the sphere model predicts, it doesn't predict that, does it? Because in one instance, they will say that this is a physical obstruction, and then when we show them pictures like the Chicago skyline, they say, oh, well, that's temperature inversion. So either it's a physical obstruction or it's not. They can't pick and choose when they want it to be physical and when they don't. And again, he has not measured whether there was a temperature inversion at every point between himself and the object, which again is what you have to do to bend light around the outer surface of a ball. So if we go on here to the next section, which is around page 68, he says there are these spotters. There's midship towers where spotters are located, and the spotters use rangefinders and other equipment to fix the distance and azimuth of the target ships. These spotters can be 150 feet above the waterline. Why do they do that? Because Danny claims that ships can fire at distant objects. These are obviously military ships. Distant objects because the spotters are higher than the guns. But do laser-guided projectiles benefit from the spotter's height, and so don't fly in a straight line? These are laser-guided. Lasers don't bend either. They have to say they bend because of conditions which they can't know ahead of time and which will keep fluctuating even while they try to line up their target. This seems like a really dodgy system to me if we're firing around a curve with a laser. And then he says, the situation has changed considerably in modern warfare. While spotters use radar and other devices may be present aboard a ship, aircraft that are much higher in the sky, can target ships that are considerably farther away. But flat earthers talk about line-of-sight weapons, not simply targeting. This is a straw man fallacy. They think that we're just talking about how you can target something. We all know that for many, perhaps thousands of years, people could use ballistic weapons that would fire up in the sky and be calculated or estimated or by experience, trial and error, to land at a certain spot given the trajectory of the ball or whatever they're throwing. And so this is nothing new, but we've been talking about laser-guided weapons. Lasers go in straight lines. That's what lasers do. That's why they're made, to keep the beam as coherent as possible for as long as possible. Even a laser will spread out eventually. It just takes a lot longer than ordinary light that isn't amplified or anything, as part of the acronym indicates. But projectiles that are laser-guided don't benefit from anybody's height. They have to fire in a straight line. If they're going to paint a target with the laser beam and not just actually make the laser a weapon, it doesn't matter. It's still targeting a straight line. And we talk about line of sight. And then he has this footnote here on his page. He says, on a flat Earth, the surface level of a large body of water is in a plane, while on a globe Earth, the surface level of a large body of water is on the surface of a sphere. Never mind how that's happening. At any point on the sphere, the surface is in a plane tangent to the sphere at that point. Since the Earth's radius is so large, a tangent is an imaginary line, and unless you're putting like something like a ruler or a straight edge on top of a ball, otherwise it's imaginary. And when it comes to the Earth, it must be imaginary. And then they talk about the Earth's radius, which no one has measured. They can only calculate from the presupposed circumference. Since the Earth's radius is so large, local curvature is not noticeable. That is to say, it's a ball, but you can't tell. You just have to trust us. Therefore, he says, the flat Earth and spherical Earth models aren't that different on the local scale. And he'll discuss this more in chapter 6. So he's presuming that water sticks uniformly to the outer surface of a sphere, and then says the surface is a plane tangent. The surface cannot be a plane tangent. Okay? So he says, at any point on the sphere, the surface is in a plane tangent to the sphere at that point. So he's not saying the water is flat. He's saying there's a tangent point. Well, a tangent point is also mostly imaginary, but as I mentioned before in an earlier video, when you're standing at a spot on Earth, if it's a ball, you are the tangent point. The horizon is not the tangent point. You're not looking down at it. But on a ball, you wouldn't really have a horizon. It would always be lower than you, but you got to presume a ball in the first place. And again, you are the tangent. The observer is the tangent point. And if you look straight, not down just a little, then, and you can verify this by using a plumb bob, so you know what straight up and down is from the surface we were standing on, and then do a 90 degrees from that. If you would put that at your feet, if you're standing on a ball, that's a tangent line, right? But from your eyeball, which may be several, however tall you are above your feet, it's going to be an imaginary line no matter what you do, but you are still the tangent point, and you still need a straight line. So he wants his cake to have his cake and eat it too, and that's all there is to it. And that's the end of chapter 2. So now we go on to chapter 3, which for me starts at page 71. And he says, as described in chapter 1, the Earth's circular shadow during a lunar eclipse was one of the earliest proofs that the Earth is spherical. This is an unsubstantiated claim that Earth's shadow is the cause of this eclipse. And again, we ask the question, have you ever seen shadow with color in it? No matter what kind of light you're shining on an object in a dark room, the shadow will be black. It'll be, depending on how much ambient light there is and how big, the distance between the light and the object will show whether the umbra and penumbra and all that. But you're not going to see a colored shadow. So he starts off with his straw man or just made up stuff. And then he says, obviously, for those who are convinced that the Earth is flat, this won't do, because the conventional explanation of lunar eclipses directly contradicts the flat Earth model. This is mockery, assigning a cause which could be easily made against him. He is trying to divine flat Earthers' motives when his motive is exactly the same. He's not going to see any evidence contrary to his position, which he is so terrified is being attacked by flat Earth, to the point where he thinks it affects someone's salvation, which again, as I've said before, salvation is by faith in the risen Jesus. It has nothing to do with whatever else you believe that may or may not be consistent with that. And people in general have this uncanny ability to go through life believing contradictory things. That doesn't mean you're not saved. Salvation is by faith alone. That's it. You can't assign someone else's inconsistency and turn a blind eye to your own and say those people must be lost because they don't agree with my cosmology. This is, again, inexcusable for someone in his position. He's not a new believer. He's not terribly young. He is experienced and calls himself a subject matter expert, so no excuses. So this is out-and-out mockery and pots and kettles. This is hypocrisy. And then he says, perhaps flat earthers fear, this is with his perhaps again, leading the reader, perhaps flat earthers fear like he does, that if they admit the conventional explanation of solar eclipses works, then it would undermine their argument against the cause of lunar eclipses. More of the same, begging the question, mocking anyone challenging his paradigm. And that's all it is. And there's no point in spending more time on it because this is going to be repeated throughout the book. This level of trolling and bad logic and hypocrisy. And then he says he has an accompanying figure that shows the situation of a lunar eclipse, but keep in mind that it's not to scale. It shows his view of what causes eclipses, the standard cosmological view that any atheist or evolutionist would be happy with, where there's the sun is some distance away and casting light, and for some reason, his diagram draws. Picture this, just a circle on the page that's the sun, and take a point at the top and the point at the bottom and draw a straight line going to the top and bottom of Earth and then continuing on to the top and bottom of the moon. Those are not parallel lines. What happened to the parallel lines of Eratosthenes? When we're doing an eclipse, somehow the lines are not parallel anymore. And I know the convention in physics to draw these lines for how light, to show how light is being bent, but that's certainly not the totality of light. And again, you can't have angled lines for one thing and then straight lines for another and say that you have any consistency in your argument. So anyway, that he shows his view of how this works. And then he says on the next page, only if a full moon occurs when the moon is near one of the nodes, the 2 points of intersection of the two orbits, does a lunar eclipse happen. What happened to Occam's razor? Where is our desired simplicity? It seems to me that modern cosmology is full of complexity. Now, just because there isn't a detailed drawing of what flat earthers may think is going on, we're at least honest enough to say we don't know. But we do know that shadows don't have color. And there is no proof that it is any kind of shadow, let alone the Earth's shadow that goes across the moon. As I've said, be careful if you do this demonstration yourself. As I have done, you will see that the light doesn't bend on a sphere the way that they expect it to, as it does compared to the moon. So anyway, he again is inconsistent in his application here of Occam's razor. And then later on, he'll say, under investigating some of Dubé's claims, why are we investigating Dubé? Does he represent all flat earthers? No, he is the part and parcel of the Flat Earth Society, which we've already indicated is not representative of most flat earthers. It is a fringe view and believed to be controlled opposition. But he says that he got some ideas from Ptolemy, etc. He gave several reasons why Earth is a sphere. This is a manifestation of the common conflation of flat Earth with geocentrism among flat earthers. Again, we're not the ones conflating these things. He insists that we are, but this is a straw man. It's not even a straw man because it's not even a weak argument that we make. It's an argument we don't make at all. We don't say this. Flat earthers don't say this that I know of. And he knows that flat earthers don't say that. If there were a few people he may have heard that said something about that they were conflating the two, he had failed to document this, but it's certainly not a representative view in any case. And then, just my note there is that Faulkner makes Dubé's alleged falsehoods the cause of the unsubstantiated claim that confusing Earth shape with geocentrism is common. Then he says on about page 74, but his method was based on the theory of a spherical moon orbiting a spherical Earth, casting a shadow on the Earth, talking about Ptolemy. Did Ptolemy say Earth was spherical or just the moon? You've got to always go to the source material yourself on the occasions he deigns to provide them and read it for yourself, because as we saw with Augustine, even when the quote that he puts in his book is accurate, doesn't even matter if it's accurate or not, it's how he understands it, and he twisted it inside out and upside down. So he says the first reasonably accurate prediction of a solar eclipse was when Edmund Halley, or Halley, depending on who you ask, predicted the path of the May 3rd, 1715 solar eclipse just a few months before the eclipse. No citation. And it seems this is probably cherry-picked, it appears. So for thousands of years prior, nobody could predict anything in the sky, even when all they needed was detailed record keeping, as we've mentioned before. He is cherry picking. There's nothing else to call it. And then he says this technique is to compute the size and motion of the moon's shadow in the fundamental plane, the plane perpendicular to the direction of the moon's umbra and passing through the spherical Earth's center. An imaginary plane of an Earth center that nobody's been to? No one has dug deeper than 8 miles through the Earth's crust. So nobody knows what's deeper down than that. How do you know where the center is? Oh, again, you start with your presumption of a spherical Earth of a certain diameter or a certain circumference, and then you pick a radius, a diameter, and from there you calculate, not measure, not observe, not sample, the center. But look at how many times he said plane. The fundamental plane, the plane perpendicular. Perpendicular, if you look at the definitions, has to do with lines, not arcs. So, and then he says, however, flat earthers don't seem to realize that the accurate predictions of eclipses, both lunar and solar, are based upon a spherical Earth in the heliocentric model and with the conventional understanding of how eclipses happen. Another unsupported claim. And who says flat earthers don't realize that Danny is presupposing his model? Everything he's saying against flat earthers can be said against him, and it's his burden to bear of having this double standard where he knows very well that evolutionists, old Earth creationists have long chastised the young Earth creationist people for giving Christianity a bad name and doing bad science, and et cetera, and then he's turning around, as I've said before, and doing the same thing to flat earthers. So he has apparently no problem with his conscience in doing such a thing, but again, we're not going to try to divine his motives when he's so clearly presenting them himself verbatim as his fear. So he must defend his model, even if it means locking arms with atheists and old Earth creationists, which this heliocentric system is based upon and couldn't exist without evolution. And yet young Earth creationism takes the results, as I've said, and not the causes. So anyway, let's go on here. There is no theory of eclipses in a flat Earth model, and hence there are no flat Earth predictions. Hasn't he mentioned flat Earth explanations that he doesn't like? So how can he now say that flat Earth has no theories about eclipses? How can you mock and debunk a flat Earth claim and then say we don't have any? And then he says, sort of as Dobé mentioned in an 18-year cycle in which eclipses repeat. This is a tiny admission that Danny's model isn't the only way to predict events in the sky. And we've said before, all you need is careful observation, lots of data points. I mean, think of all the ancient artifacts that accurately track the sun's annual trip around the tropics, between the tropics, and the solstices and all that sort of thing. It goes back thousands and thousands of years, way before anybody thought of a ball Earth. And he will try to backdate an anachronistic fallacy and say, no, everybody believed it was a ball from the earliest times. That seems to be his argument. But anyway, let's move on because we could just, we're just into chapter 2. So he says, Dobé undoubtedly, this is a guess, is relying upon Rowbotham's Zetetic Astronomy, page 151, 154, for his information. Again, with the divining of other people's motives or sources. If he doesn't know, he shouldn't try to cite it as something that bolsters his argument. So anyway, unbecoming of a PhD. And then he says, these two eclipses are separated in time by 3 Saros cycles. Who needs Occam's razor anyway? I mean, Saros cycles and all these things, these are not simplicities. The flat Earth model, if there is one, and there really isn't one, but the more common belief, and this isn't really a belief because it's observation, is that the sun and moon follow paths above our heads, which is what we see and how the Bible portrays it, such as in Joshua's long day. But we'll get more to the the Bible toward the end of the book when he finally gets around to it. But anyway, this is a complexity. Okay, if you look into sorrow cycles and etc. And then he says, this makes it impossible to spot the regularities hidden in the data. Instead, ancient cultures figured out the real causes of eclipses, the Earth coming between the sun and moon for a lunar, and the moon between the sun and Earth for a solar. So every ancient culture had to take all other cultures' observations into account in order to predict sky events in their own country? That's what he's arguing. Citation for these cultures figuring out the real causes of eclipses? No, it's just more question-begging and baseless assertions. That's what this book is. That's why there's not much to say about it, because there aren't any valid points being made. Now, he talks about someone called Thales, Thales, and he says, we have no writings of Thales, so what we know about him and his accomplishments come from much later sources. So why are we mentioning him? And if we don't know anything about him except from later sources, why shouldn't we also dismiss all of Danny's sources too? If he thinks this guy's a source for flat Earth, he can cite them, but we can't, and we have to accept all of his sources that are of dubious authenticity. Then he says, first, Dubé claims that this is a common occurrence on Selenelian eclipses, which is called also the impossible eclipse, because both the sun and the moon are visible above the horizon in the sky at the same time. So how can one be a shadow, casting a shadow on the other? So he says that Dubé claims this is a common occurrence, but it's not. And I say this is irrelevant. It's a single event. Any single event would disprove Danny's model. That's the concept of a black swan, because if the argument is if someone says all swans are white, all you have to do is find one that isn't, and the claim is debunked. That's all it takes is one. And so if there's one exception that doesn't work in the heliocentric model, it is debunked. And then moving on, second, he seemed to imply that both the sun and the moon are relatively high in the sky when this occurs. They aren't. In other words, Danny's making a straw man argument. He's just grasping at straws, basically, and picking the non-common to try to debunk something that would work against him. If at any time we decided to do that, we could do it easily. Then he says, during every lunar eclipse, there's a lune-shaped region of the Earth's surface where the eclipse begins at sundown. He doesn't define this term. You have to go look it up yourself, which is very disappointing from a PhD. It is the crescent-shaped region bounded by two circles, which again begs the question. Danny thus claims that this phenomenon is just an overlapping of presumed curve-shaped shadows. He's just making stuff up. Now, he says, given these caveats and various things you can read about in the book, while it is theoretically possible to witness a Selenelian at every lunar eclipse, actually seeing one is relatively rare. Who cares? So what if it's rare? Is a black swan rare? Yeah. Does that mean they don't exist? No. And then under other flat Earth claims about eclipses, he says, first, the shadow on the moon during a lunar eclipse isn't just curved, but it's curved a particular way. It is circular. So a curve isn't specific enough. It would have to be a certain way, which Danny failed to specify. Second, he says, by using an orange or some other spherical object, the demonstration explicitly accepts that the moon is a sphere. Danny misses the point, which is to show how light and shadow behaves on spheres, and how his model doesn't prove it's an Earth shadow or that Earth must be a sphere. He's still begging the question at every turn. Then he says, but this is not what most flat earthers think about the moon. They think the moon is a round disk like the Earth. Who does? Where's this data to support the claim of what most flat earthers think? We still don't have one. And flat earthers don't claim Earth is a flat disk at all. So why would anything else be a flat disk? Burning the same straw man over and over and over. Then he says, the curve will be in the wrong direction as it moves off, hence the subterfuge of not following this experiment through. Danny failed to provide any demonstration of what would happen. Where are his demonstrations? Oh, he would have to do a video or something. Gosh, that would be like YouTube or something, and we can't get anything true from there because that's where flat earthers get their information. And I'm pretty sure that Answers in Genesis puts out videos too. Lots of Christian organizations do. So there we have, when he does that, he's blaming the medium and shooting the messenger, and he's not paying attention to the message and trying to use that as an excuse. It's just like sometimes you'll find true things on Wikipedia, but a lot of times, especially when it's political, and I would say philosophical when it comes to quote-unquote science, you can't trust them. And this is why universities don't allow people to use Wiki as a source. But that doesn't mean there's nothing true on Wiki, does it? Anyway, you can see my videos on how light curves around a ball if you're interested in demonstrating that. And then he says, fourth, these videos attempt to kick up dust about the cause of lunar eclipses in the conventional understanding, but they do nothing to advance their model. What model? Missing the point yet again of debunking his model, not promoting flat Earth at that time. He doesn't seem to remember what his book is about, but saying, where are your videos? And then saying, oh, you've got his videos. You get your information from videos. Why don't you make some more? Oh, anyway, and then he says, they claim that the moon has its own light, so there's no, well, that's what the Bible says. So there's no shadow falling on the moon during a lunar eclipse. If that's the case, then what's the point of these demonstrations? That's a good question for him, too. He's wondering why the videos don't make his point rather than theirs when it comes to flat earthers. Are videos good or bad? We can't figure that out. And then page 80 or so, he says, under these conditions, the two successive projections cancel, and we see the same shape shadow that we would see if the moon were flat. He just admitted that Earth could be flat. You can't tell the difference. It's just like when supposedly Einstein said that you cannot tell whether it's the Earth spinning and the sky remaining still, which is kind of funny when you think about the fact that they believe in Big Bang and that everything's always in motion, or whether the Earth is still and the heavens move around us. He said you can't tell. Anyway, he talks about a demonstration that's flawed, and the only reason he calls it flawed is because it isn't set up to his model's presuppositions. That's all it takes to make something flawed. He says it's not clear if some of the people doing these demonstrations about shadows and such intentionally set out to fool people or were deceived themselves. Calling anyone who disagrees with him stupid or lying, what would he say about the National Geographic farce with a toy boat going over the curve on a small lake? Talk about bad science making his view look even worse than it is, where you can clearly see the other side of the lake, and yet they put their camera really low to the water and have a boat float away and say, oh, look, it's disappearing bottom first, never mind optics. Or, I don't know, any kind of disturbance, optical disturbance that would produce a mirage of any sort that he just talked about. Never mind that. Look, the bottom disappeared first, and there's the horizon on the other side of the lake. So how is curvature of the Earth hiding the bottom of the boat in the National Geographic farce? Why doesn't someone like this PhD call them out for making them look bad? And then he says, as before, this video is a misrepresentation. It doesn't even matter what video he's talking about because this is just ad hom, presuming motive, ignoring all such misrepresentations by him or anyone else, which he's done from the very cover of his book on. And then we get to around page 80, 81, somewhere in there. And he says, this is a matter of observational fact that even flat earthers must agree with about which way the sun and the moon and stars go and things like that. Flat earthers are all about observation. So if something's observed directly, of course we agree. The must, oh, you must be forced to agree, is just another swipe at his own straw man. He is assigning motive once again, saying that we don't want to see what we're seeing. No, we're the people who are just saying, look at what I see, look at what I observe, And he's saying, you don't see what you think you see. That's his side of the argument. And then he says, we're looking up at the sky, not down as on the earth with a map. So he tries to solve a problem that doesn't exist among flat earthers, confusing east and west. That's his theme here in these paragraphs, is that we somehow don't know east from west. Go figure. I mean, you just have to, if you can force yourself to do it, read the book for yourself. But I'm just highlighting things as I went along and not dwelling on them too much, because what's the point? Anyway, he says, this is very important. If this left to right motion is due to Earth's rotation, then the Earth's shadow must also move left to right at the same speed that the sun moves left to right. That's a very big if. What matters is the relative positions of the sun and moon when it comes to any sort of eclipse, in which case the moon would act as the pivot point of the shadow. So the light is moving, the sun and the moon don't move at the same speed, which would make the shadow move in the opposite direction. And I have a link here. Hopefully I'll remember to put in the description of the video, where I show this pivot point demonstration. And then he says, let's see, let me get my page markers here. I'm trying to match them up, and sometimes they match and sometimes they don't. But anyway, he says, notice that it's the moon's monthly orbital motion, right to left, that causes the Earth's umbra to fall on the moon. Orbital begs the question. The Bible doesn't say anything about an orbit, and you can't prove there's an orbit. All you can do is observe the regular habits of the moon and the sun and everything else, which anyone could do without a complex theory that defies Occam's razor. So let's go on. He says the flaw here is that the videos use very small light sources that were smaller than the objects used. It's flawed because it doesn't use his model as a presumption. He's talking about, he says that he has a figure where he produced the final photograph of something with the location of the moon on the previous 2 mornings marked with white circles, and he says it's just doing certain things and where the shadow is. Anyway, he says that he's assuming there's an orbital motion and that it's Earth's shadow, and it's just the same assumptions. He has not established those as facts, and yet he's building on them. So then he says his next figure demonstrates what happens when light source is larger, causing the shadow. But my remark is that since the sun is allegedly much farther away and the moon is very close to Earth, relatively speaking, according to them, light size is irrelevant. The distance makes the sun and moon the same size by our observation. Also, what happened to parallel rays from the sun regarding Eratosthenes? It's disingenuous for Danny to make the sun large given its great distance. What's the difference between a small light that's near and a large light that's far away? You can't tell which is which. All we know is that in the sky, the sun is the brightest thing when it's up, of course. The moon, when it's visible in the night sky, is the brightest thing and very much bigger than anything else. And it's easy to zoom in on. You can see some features of the moon with your naked eye, some of which there's a crater that is supposedly 50 miles wide, and just somehow with your naked eye you can resolve this over 230,000 miles. Makes no sense. Plus we're looking through our air. But that's what they tell us, and we're supposed to just believe these inconsistencies. Anyway, Danny doesn't have an accurate proportional distance between the ball and the white screen in his demonstration where he did something at work, where he set up had someone stand holding a ball or something and played with the distances and all that. But he doesn't even try to keep the proportions right in his own model because of where the sun is, how big and far away it is, and the moon in relation to the earth. And he says the morning he did this little test, the sky was very clear. So as soon as the sun rose above the trees on the east end of the employee parking lot at Answers in Genesis, I asked a coworker to hold the volleyball over her head so that it cast a shadow on a makeshift white screen nearby. And he says nearby was 40 feet. Danny doesn't have an accurate proportional distance between the ball and the white screen. If the sun to Earth is about 93 million miles, and Earth to Moon is about 250,000, then the Earth to Moon distance is 1 over 372,000 of that from the Earth to the Sun. So Danny should have had the white screen pretty much touching the ball. So how's this proving anything? It's not. And then he talks about recently deceased Bob Nodell from YouTube, and he said that he didn't see the moon move in and block the sun or move away afterwards in a solar eclipse, so it must have been something else that blocked the sun. It's not a necessary flat Earth claim, and not all flat earthers agree on this. All you would really have to do, and I don't know if anyone has done this, is track the moon through an entire month so that you know where the moon would be when you can't see it, assuming it didn't just disappear, which you can't even assume, but trying it both ways, assuming if the moon is actually not producing light for some reason or another during new moon, which is when a solar eclipse happens, all you'd have to do is say, where was the moon the last time I saw it, and where do I see it, the next time it's partially visible, where is it? And can I draw a line between those two and see whether the moon was in that vicinity? As far as I know, it probably is. But we still don't know for sure what is going on with a new moon, and we don't know for sure whether there's anything else that appears in that spot. So scientifically speaking, you wouldn't make presumptions of anything. You would say, well, the probability is that it's the moon, but we can't even see anything to do, any features to identify it as the moon during a solar eclipse. But anyway, the point here is that it's not a necessary flat Earth claim. Why is Danny spending time on it? He says we lack curiosity, and he finds this utterly amazing, but he has no citation for this claim. He doesn't name any flat earthers who lack curiosity. And if we lacked curiosity, why wouldn't we just believe what we were spoon-fed in public school? He doesn't name anybody, and we can name hundreds of ball earthers who could also be charged with this. They lack curiosity. In fact, they are against it, as Danny is, because they're afraid of their paradigm being shot down, if we're going to assign motives, as Danny has been demonstrating by example that we should do. And then he says that he talks about Buddhist texts, about this Rahu and Ketu that they think that a minority, probably of flat earthers, mentioned from Hindu astrology, the ascending and descending nodes in the moon's orbit. Rahu is mentioned in Buddhist texts. Obviously, this identification is problematic for those flat earthers who claim that the heliocentric and globe earth theories are pagan in origin. What? So Buddhist texts are an origin of flat earth? Didn't he spend a chapter saying everyone knew Earth was spherical in ancient times? And Danny, do tell us why all the planets are named after pagan gods. And the days of the week, for that matter. Is Danny arguing that this isn't a problem for Christians who believe in ball Earth? Pots and kettles. And then moving on here, he has a picture of a solar eclipse, which is an obvious composite image because you can see detail of the moon. I could go into any photo editing program and do the same. This is obviously not a raw photograph. It's a composite where they put detail on the moon in front of the sun and try to pass this off as somehow what they observe. You can't take a photo like this. Nobody has ever shown detail of the moon's topography during a solar eclipse, as far as I know. And of course, there's no citation given for the origin of this image. Let me look close here. I could try to blow it up, but I don't want to do that right now. I'm having some vision issues, but I'm pretty sure there's nothing but a composite is what you're going to find for that. So anyway, he says, from an earlier discussion, I pointed out that the moon's orbital motion, he presumed, is west to east. Yeah, the moon goes that way. So the moon's umbra also moves from west to east. It makes no sense. The moon is moving too slowly also to account for shadow speed during an eclipse. Oh, but the sun is moving faster. Yeah, the sun moves faster than the moon. We already established that. But again, we'll have a link to the video I made showing this idea of the pivot point, and that'll help explain things a little better. And then he says there's another trend among flat earthers. He says you can consult maps and things. I'm sorry, that's not a trend, flat earthers, but he's saying anyone can check these trends, all sorts of trends that he's mentioned before. And he says, consult any published maps and times of the path of totality for any solar eclipse. We're about to see one in a couple days. He says this trend, among others, is a consequence of the Earth's sphericity and hence amounts to evidence that the Earth is spherical. Affirming the consequent again. And isn't this the way the fossil record is evidence of evolution according to old Earth creationists and atheist scientists? It sure is. And then he says, hence the prediction of the paths of solar eclipses are based upon sphere Earth model. So the model provides the results it was designed to provide. What a shock. And then he again complains there's no flat Earth predictions of eclipses because Earth shape has nothing to do with them. Eclipses happen to the sun and moon, and everybody knows about when, and you can calculate this if you have the data points and you've been watching it for years. You can figure this out without knowing anything about the shape of the Earth. And then he talks about the greatest improvement of certain things is that we now have of the moon's orbit around the Earth's slowing rotation, a better understanding, and predicting eclipse paths into the near future. This isn't a problem. However, when predicting eclipse paths for possible coordination with historic events from centuries ago, precise knowledge of the Earth's slowing rotation is especially important. Really? And then he says, without considering this factor, the predicted path and actual path of an eclipse will be displaced in longitude. Hasn't Earth's alleged orbit always been slowing? This isn't a new problem. And what does it prove about Earth shape? And he says, then he goes on to say, for instance, some flat earthers note that these canons are on a NASA website as far as records of eclipses, yet have disclaimers that Fred Espanek assumes responsibility for their accuracy. Why that's a problem is a mystery to me. It's called a self-fulfilling prophecy, Danny. That's all that is. And then he says, flat earthers intone that astronomers deny that they use the Saros cycle for predicting eclipses, but this is a tacit admission that they do use the Saros cycle to predict eclipses. He never backs up the claim that NASA doesn't use them, but only takes their claim at face value, whereas flat earthers look for more actions than words. And then he'll talk about standards, which is laughable at this point. The standard for expressing the position of the centers of the sun and moon is the Earth's center. Really? With Earth as the static reference point about which the luminaries move? He missed the point again. If everything's relative, then how can you even say how fast the Earth is moving through space, or the sun is moving through space, or the stars are moving? Everything is relative to a fixed point. And if it's not, then you have to say it's a relative speed to something else you decided to match it to. So you treat everything as though the Earth is still at the center. That's the only way you can get a relative speed that means anything. And, well, welcome to Flat Earth. And then he says, therefore, the videos sniping at the Eclipse website are based upon ignorance of the information presented there. This is condescending, ad hom, and he just keeps doing that. And he says, this, along with the tilt of the moon's orbit, preventing there being a solar eclipse every month, is indication of design. Wait a minute, design? Are we arguing Earth shape or creation? Didn't he say that he's afraid of Christians becoming flat earthers and losing their faith as Christians because of it? And yet, from my experience, there have been many people who became Christians as a result of understanding that Earth is flat. But why is he bringing whether there's a creator or not into this? That's not even a question. And he says, after his ad homs and all that sort of thing, he says, this fact, that's where the design was. Sorry, I got off on the pages. He says, and this Earth is the only planet where it matters because it's the only planet where there are inhabitants who can appreciate all this stuff. I see the hand of a very gracious, kind, and artistic creator in this. Who says Earth is a planet, and who is denying there's a creator? He doesn't know what the topic of his own book is sometimes. He says it's truly a shame that so many flat earthers are so wrapped up in their conspiratorial beliefs, which he accuses us of being, so he has conspiratorial beliefs, that they fail to see this indication of design staring them in the face. Many flat earthers have stated, as I mentioned, that flat earth brought them to belief in the creator, and atheist flat earthers whine about the number of religious people. So what point is Danny trying to make here? And why is he making it in this book? Isn't he complaining, as I said, about Christian flat earthers? Isn't this what he's afraid of? People aren't disbelieving in a creator because Earth is flat. They disbelieve in it because of heliocentrism and evolution. Pots and kettles. And then going on to chapter 4, he says, both the spherical Earth model and the flat Earth model, which we don't claim one, make specific predictions about the aspects of the sky, so the aspects of the sky provide good tests of either model. No, they don't. First, flat Earth doesn't claim to be a model. Second, we all see the same things in the sky, just as old Earthers and young Earthers see the same things in the fossil record. It won't prove anything. He says, for simplicity, we can assume that the celestial sphere, the imaginary presumed celestial sphere, spins around the Earth each day on an axis coincident with the Earth's rotation axis. There's that desired simplicity again. But this time, Danny shows that a stationary Earth is simpler, Occam's razor and all that. Regardless of what the sky does, it still says nothing about the shape of the Earth. Why are you looking at the ceiling when you want to study the floor? And he says some flat earthers may gleefully object that I've changed the model here. I can envision Danny sticking out his tongue and saying, ha ha ha, as he writes this. The playground bully mentality is getting worse with each chapter. And I think I don't even need to tell you that. And then he says, however, if this model isn't true, it doesn't mean that it isn't useful. So Danny has unwittingly shot down his own model, since it too could be useful without being true. Be careful what claims you make. Always test them yourself before you test them on anybody else. You would think a PhD would know this. Then he says, on or about page 100, the axis of the celestial sphere's spin intersects with the celestial sphere in two places. This paragraph describes an apparent motion of the sky caused by a presumed spinning ball Earth. This is an example of Danny's useful but not true model, which we're just doing, accepting what he said. And then he says, in the flat Earth model, the Earth is a flat disk with a dome above. This is a bald-faced lie from someone who knows better. Danny knows that the only controlled opposition group, Flat Earth Society, says that Earth is a disk flying through space, which is on his book cover. The truth is that the surface we live on is a flat plane, but underneath it could be any shape, since it's essentially the floor of the whole realm as far as what God created, and then there's waters below and above and all around us. Whether the sky is dome-shaped is not an essential flat Earth claim. Again. And then he says the sun and moon are not spheres, but instead are round and flat like the Earth. Again, not typical or necessary for flat Earth. Danny deliberately and continually misrepresents flat Earth, which is burning a straw man. And then he shows an illustration he calls the flat Earth model. At least this time he doesn't have it flying through space and water dripping off the edge. He shows an ice wall, which is another non-essential flat Earth belief, and a dome. I know that Answers in Genesis really detested the teachings of Michael Heiser, who is a subject matter expert on ancient Semitic languages and all that. And his opinion, as I think I've mentioned before, is that even though he was believed fully in evolution and older, and all of that, everything Danny believes in more, and the old Earth creationists believe, as Heiser was, then nonetheless, the Bible said something else. The Bible described Earth as a flat plane with ground underneath it, the place of the dead. The realm of the dead is beneath the earth, or in the heart of the earth, which doesn't mean center, and that there's a sky above and a firmament which holds the waters above. He recognized that's what the text says, regardless of whether he believed it. And that's the illustration that Danny has in his book here. And then next is a section called Sunrise and Sunset. And he says, later the rotation, it doesn't matter which is rotating the Earth or it's a celestial sphere, carries the sun to a location where it once again crosses the plane of the horizon. He says it doesn't matter in the description of his own model, just to keep that in mind. And then around page 103, he says, imagine the flat Earth model with a dome covering the surface of a round flat underneath. Imagine Danny's straw man. Therefore, from any location on the Earth, a person can always see every point in the sky. This is inexcusable ignorance of the physics of light, especially in a large area with many changing conditions we mentioned before between the object and the observer. This whole paragraph is filled with horrible logic and false claims. And then he says, let me demonstrate the folly of this answer with some numbers. Yes, Danny, do a good job exposing your own folly. That's the only folly that's going to be exposed here. And again, you're not demonstrating anything with numbers. You're just calculating. And then he says, under the changing apparent size of the sun, he says, since the sun is much closer to us, its apparent size must change throughout the day. Where is it stated as official flat Earth teaching that the sun is a certain size and distance from Earth's surface? Can't we use the same Earth is so big argument ball earthers use for why the surface measures flat? That locality that he talked about earlier? That locally it seems like this way, but we know it's a ball? So why can't we use that when it comes to the sun and moon? Nobody has proposed an actual hard and fast distance above us of the sun and moon and stars. So he's making things up and burning straw men. And then he says around page 105, next near a figure 2 in this chapter of a right triangle, he says, if the sun were properly exposed, then the sun would show no change in apparent size. He cherry-picked only videos where a solar filter wasn't used. Just to keep that in mind if you read the book. And then he says it's not difficult to quantify the prediction of the flat Earth model. What prediction? What model? It's not difficult as long as you ignore optical conditions. The only time of day when the sun's physical location would be at a minimal distortion would be solar noon. And we still don't know its size or distance. And even then, the equinox would be the best time to do this. And you stand on the equator, where at the equinox, the sun will rise at 90 degrees on the azimuth or a compass dial and set at 270. And so it's directly in a straight line, but it's only when it's directly above you at its zenith that you will have minimal distortion as to its actual location, as far as you can tell looking through who knows what between you and the sun, because nobody knows what the conditions are at every point. So anyway, as far as what the sun should appear like on a flat Earth as to compared to a ball Earth, I don't think he realizes how many times he's shooting down his own argument. And he says, skipping a few pages, that he talks about exposures, and he's taking these images. He says, note the image of the sun in the first photograph is fainter than on the second. This is because of the dimming and reddening due to atmospheric extinction. Another failure to define terms. According to a source I have here in my notes, we call this dimming of stellar light extinction. Astronomers have devised the term air mass to describe this quantity. One air mass is the amount of air directly above an observer. So if you're looking at a star at the zenith, that is to say it's 90 degrees from where you're standing, you're looking through one air mass. End quote. It goes on to explain, quote, as light makes its way Through the Earth's atmosphere, which is an oxymoron, gas doesn't take a shape, it passes through many different layers of air. I've been saying this all along. Each layer has a slightly different temperature, pressure, and density. There may also be slight differences in chemical composition, dust, and water content. That means that the index of refraction of each layer is a little different. Doesn't say it's increasingly thickening as it comes to you along the surface of a ball. As a ray of light travels from layer to layer, it is bent by slightly differing angles. That's refraction. By the time it reaches the ground, the ray has probably shifted to a slightly different position than it would have had in the absence of atmosphere. The atmosphere is constantly in motion. In addition to making images fuzzy, the atmosphere can also change their color. All of these factors, that's the end of quote, all of these factors make locating a luminary and calculating its size more of a probability than a certainty. So nobody knows. Nobody can know. And all those conditions are a huge problem for anybody claiming to study the sky from Earth. And then later on we have to talk about their alleged satellites that get beyond Earth's air mass. But anyway, we'll go on here. As noted earlier, no, the alleged model of flat Earth does not require anything he says it requires, especially consider the many variables due to atmospheric extinction, which I've been talking about. And then he says he's got some predictions here, and I'll just kind of skip past that. He says, it's interesting that those who promote the flat Earth model never quantify their predictions in this manner, because if they did, their predictions would not match what we observe. And I had trouble with the highlighter here. This is another snipe at presumed motives, still based on Danny's forest full of straw men. Okay, and that's all it is, a forest full of straw men. All right, one more little bit here. He says that, of course, we do not observe with the sun and moon as they rise and set. Why should perspective require the sun and moon to move more quickly at their zenith when we're not looking horizontally but vertically? And he's forgotten how big and distant they allegedly are. And then we look at where he says clearly in the flat Earth movement or model, sorry about that, people well outside the Arctic Circle ought to see the midnight sun. Since they don't, this disproves flat Earth's model. His premise of the sun's height and his misunderstanding of how the horizon is simply the limit of vision lead him to the erroneous conclusion that the midnight sun in the Arctic must prove something about Earth's shape. And then he says the correct situation is shown as his little diagram, which I think is on page 111, where he talks about zenith angles. But again, he's starting with a vertex point for his angles in the center of Earth, also known from the Nathan Oakley channel, I think is where it originated, Hell's Angles. This is a play on words with Hell's Angels. They always start their angles at the center of the presupposed ball Earth with a presupposed circumference and diameter, and draw an imaginary straight line from there to the surface. That's a radius. And then they draw straight angles off of those lines. But if you're trying to measure the Earth, you have to measure the surface we live on, not some imaginary point way below the Earth, which, according to the Bible, would be hell, the realm of the dead. So he's showing that he begs a question in his diagram. And then he says, and we'll stop at this one, the sun's rays being tangent to the Earth's surface mean that the sun is on the horizon. Parallel sun rays again? What happened to the angled ones in the discussion of eclipses? And what happened to the great distance from the sun to the Earth? These things, you got to make a chart if you want to go through this book and keep track of all the flip-flopping that's going on. I may go a little farther just to finish his chapter here instead of just my notes. He says, hence, Dubé's case against the conventional model is a straw man. Pot, meet, kettle. I have to say that Faulkner is the king of straw man building and burning. And then he says, as it turns out, there are videos on the internet showing the midnight sun from Antarctica, the place where you can't go without express permission. And there are videos on that from Taboo Conspiracy detailing the Antarctic Treaty And you can't even go very far inland, and I have a link for that. And he says, he ends this chapter with, "This is so common with flat earthers. They dismiss any evidence that contradicts their model as fake, but they utterly fail to understand that flat earthers can and do fake data. Ad hominem aside, the burden of proof for authenticating videos is on those who make them. The restricted access to Antarctica should be a giant red flag even before accepting any videos shot from there. So let's be skeptical, right?" And then he says, "How can one rationally discuss a topic when the other side dismisses data so cavalierly?" An excellent question, Danny. Tell us why we should give the time of day to someone like you who sneers, mocks, misrepresents, and obsesses over what he has already decided cannot be true, and he admitted when he expressed his fear of flat Earth. Okay, so I have one more note, but it kind of goes into it's actually not the next chapter, it's the next section, but I'll go over it anyway so I can have a good stopping point for my notes. "The horizon is the horizontal plane tangent to the Earth at one's location. Tangent presupposes a ball. Horizon is the basis of the word horizontal, and he invokes a plane, and then says this plane is tangent. What good is imaginary line if we're talking about the shape of the Earth?" That's where we're going to stop today. And again, I hope you found this useful, although tedious. And I'm not doing the most thorough job, but again, I don't want to have copyright issues. If I showed the book, actually, which would be a little easier to do if I could, but we're being super safe here. Anyway, this is just more evidence, and we're going through the book page by page just to show that A, I've read it, and B, what kind of person wrote this book. You can draw your own conclusions and make your own decision about what to do with those conclusions and what you're going to do with that information. So we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.